So if you're new to Ableton or home recording, you've probably run across the issue of muddy mixes or mixes that just don't sound great in general. You may have watched a couple of tutorials and gotten fairly confused fairly quickly. For some reason, there's this thing with YouTube tutorials on mixing where things get needlessly complex very, very quickly. And that's kind of why I wanted to make this video, was to sort of simplify everything and create a foundation for you guys to start getting good mixes and building upon that knowledge. My name's Tim, and just getting this out of the way, I am not a professional mixer, though I have mixed professionally in the past, go figure. This is all stuff that I've picked up through the years working in production, and I'm passing along to you. It's all stuff that I wish I was told earlier on, so I hope this benefits you. By the end of this video, my promise to you is that you'll have the knowledge to create a really solid sounding mix of any one of your tracks, no matter the genre. So I always think it's a good idea to start by defining what we're doing here. Mixing at its very basic level is just creating a balance out of everything. To those of you who played in bands before, you might have remembered going into a garage with a drummer. Everybody brings their amps. Everyone turns everything up to 10 so that they can hear themselves over the drummer, and then it's just this wall of noise. At some point, someone has the brilliant idea of telling the drummer to play just a little quieter. The bass player maybe turns down a little bit. The guitar player turns down a little bit. That's mixing. That's at its very basic core. That's a mix. At some point, microphones get introduced to amplifiers and drums. They all feed into a mixing board. The mixing board, now you have control to create balance. Along with that, you have EQ. And EQ is really a surgical knife that you can cut around the instruments to create space for everything so that everything fits together. At its core, that's basically what mixing is. So I've created a fairly basic demo track here. Let's take a listen to it and see what we've got. Starting with a snare and hat loop. We've got a kick. Got a synth part. We've got some plucks. A melody synth line. Bass line. And a guitar line. So the first thing that you're going to want to be aware of is, as you're creating tracks or dragging clips in, Ableton will always set your track level to 0 decibels, which is fine when you're in session mode and you're just kind of jamming and messing around. But when it comes to actually putting a track together, that's far too high. So if you have a synth at 0, you add a guitar line at 0, you add a kick drum at 0, in no time at all, your master is going to be hitting the red, or what's called clipping. And that's something that we want to avoid. So what we need to do during the mixing stage is bring everything down to create what's called headroom, so that we have room to work with. By bringing the overall volume of everything down, we now have created space to work with and play with our levels. So the way I was taught was to bring everything down to -10, with the exception of your kick, which you would leave at -7. To me, the kick is the most important part. That's the sort of the heart of your song. So I like to keep that at -7 in order to build everything around that. I've also recently taken to doing that with my bass track as well, leaving that at -7, so that you sort of have a melodic low end element as well. You can sort of mess with that and decide for yourself. The main focus instrument that I'm aiming for in this is my guitar, so I also left that at -7. And now at this point, we can start playing around with the various balances of things. Okay, so some general rules on EQing. One, don't overdo it, particularly if you're getting samples off of, say, Splice. A lot of the stuff is already EQ'd to begin with. So you don't need to go nuts in terms of boosting low ends or, creating crackling highs or anything like that. The sound has already been EQ'd, so you don't need to go nuts. Really what you're doing is you're EQing within the context of your own track. I do like to use the analogy, like you go into a restaurant and you order like a $75 steak, and then when it comes out, you pour ketchup all over it. It's sort of insulting to the chef, and it's going to ruin your meal as well. Generally with EQ, the way that you want to look at it is subtractive instead of additive. You want to be taking frequencies away, not adding them into there. My old audio teacher hammered it into us that you can't boost frequencies that aren't there. So for the most part, stick to subtractive EQ, carving things away. When you start boosting frequencies, which is necessary from time to time if something's not kind of popping out, but as you do that, you're going to create more phase issues, which is going to lead to more mud. There's two reasons that I went with this. One, it's only 7 tracks, so it's easy to keep an eye on everything that's going on. And then on top of it, with those 3 synth tracks and the guitar, there's lots of frequency bleed and overlap, which is a good way of showing how to avoid sort of creating those like phasing and masking issues. The first thing that we'll want to do is put an EQ8 on each one of our tracks. Our EQ controls are as follows. You normally sort of see the EQ here. If you hit this little triangle button, you can see an expanded version of it. So in order to control your EQs, if you just start pulling at these numbers, you'll see that we can kind of create bands, right? But we can also control the shape with something like this shape, which is a low pass filter. So that means if I were to move it over, say here, anything beneath here is cut, right? There's also a high pass filter, the opposite, where now everything on this side of the frequency spectrum is now no longer playing unless I sweep over it this way. And then we can also do these dips so that if I have certain frequencies within a waveform that I want to hack out of it, I could do so this way. There are various other modes as well, but those are pretty much the 3 most common that you're going to end up using. So let's check out our melody synth line, for example. With the EQ8 on, we can see where it resides in the frequency spectrum. So you can see it takes up a lot of space. It really mostly resides in the 1K to 10K area, although it has some stuff happening in the 1K and below area. We really don't need that stuff. If you listen as I play this, as I remove everything underneath 1K, we're not really missing anything. Now coming over to our kick, we'll take a look at that. We can see that very much lives in the 100 to 1K area, bleeding down to like the 20s and 30s. By cutting the low end on this melody synth, we've left room for the kick to live in those frequencies as well. And we want to make space for each one of our tracks in the areas that they shine. So Sweetwater actually has a really good cheat sheet up of where each instrument lives in the frequency spectrum. You can go through and sort of chart where on the frequency spectrum each instrument is and correlate that back to your EQ8. So heading back to the chart in Sweetwater, our electric guitar resides somewhere between the 200 hertz frequency range and the 5K frequency range. So we move that into Ableton. So while it's a good starting point, to me that sounds a little thin, so I actually am going to roll it back to around 80-ish or so. Though I don't want to get too deep into the woods with compression and other effects, but I do want to talk about sidechain compression here really quickly. Particularly with your bass track, what you're going to want to do is put a glue compressor on it and then hit this little triangle button. There's a sidechain button here. Click that on and then take your audio from your kick. So what that's going to do is it's going to duck your bass track every time the kick hits. So this is necessary because when you have 2 lower frequency things happening at the same time, it's going to create a lot of energy in there and it's going to create a lot of mud. By putting this glue compressor here, what we're doing is every time the kick hits, the bass is just going to kind of duck out of the way. So let's take a listen here just with the bass and the kick. Generally, what you're going to want to do here is play with your threshold until you're hitting somewhere between the 5 and the 10 mark. There are some other buttons you can hit, like soft clipping. You can experiment around with that. Or if you hit this EQ button and set it to a low pass, you can basically tell the compressor, ignore everything underneath a certain frequency range. So, feel free to experiment around with that a little bit. So now we have everything leveled and we have our various frequencies all scalpeled out. The last part of it is now to create the stereo image. And this is the fun part where you're just sort of messing around with the pans. So in general, the things that you're going to want to keep in the center are your kicks and your bass, snare just off to the side. Here's actually one that I ran across from Sonable. You can pause this and screenshot it or whatever, or go to their site to check it out. This is pretty much where you want things to live in the stereo spectrum. As we move things to the front, that's taken care of in volume. Towards the rear is obviously decreasing the volume, and left and right are panning from left to right. So one plugin that I actually do like for this part of it is a plugin called Visual Mixer from iZotope, which allows you to sort of, like, that's my kick. I can literally move it around the stereo spectrum. It's visually, you can actually see where you're placing things in the stereo field. So So obviously a terrible example of a mix, but it shows you what it does there. So the last one I would do is under utility, this bass mono plugin. I would just throw that on your master channel, set it to about 90, and that just ensures that anything that's happening at 90 hertz and below is in mono, as you don't want stereo frequencies happening at that frequency level. And honestly, that's about it. Everything that you've seen up until this point is pretty much what you need to know to create a basic mix. There are a lot of other things that we can do: parallel compression, sends, reverbs, that sort of thing. And we will get to those if you're interested. Let me know if this was all easy enough for you to understand, and if it's something that you would like to hear more about, in which case I'll follow it up with a part 2 that will include mastering and all of that stuff. Yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. In the meantime, you can also check out the 3 hot tips on Ableton in 3 minutes video that I did. Those are just some quick hit tips that you might find useful, all in less than 3 minutes. Okay, until next time, we'll see ya.